Hello and welcome to another podcast at Dollars and Cents. This is your co-host Krish, and I've got Manpreet with me here today as well. Welcome, Manpreet.
Thank you. Welcome.
Today we are going to talk about something very, very critical, and that is worth a $3.5 trillion investment vehicle in Australia as of June. It is a vehicle that everyday Australians that has worked in their life has access to and probably has some money sitting in there. And it shows the magnitude of the size. It also shows the magnitude of getting it right, how important that is for a person's future. And that is superannuation. It is a very big asset class. Besides the family home, for most people, it also means the second largest asset that they hold. Now, it is government mandated. We have to have superannuation if we are working because our employees pay currently 11.5% of our salary goes into superannuation with the intention to keep increasing that. So it does make up a very big portion. And today, Manpreet, I would love to hear a bit more about this investment vehicle, how it works and what it does. So to kick us off, in layman's term, what exactly is a superannuation and how does it impact everyday working class Aussies?
Yes, thanks, Krish. So, in very simple terms, a superannuation is money that's set aside for your retirement. And essentially, when we work, our employer puts in an amount from our paycheck into superannuation. Now, that amount will vary depending on your income and what the agreement is with your employer, I should say, in terms of what percentage of your pay they will put into a superannuation. Now, so we know that it's for our retirement. So what that actually means is basically most people now can only access their super once they're 60 and above. There are a few caveats there, but without getting too technical right yet, in a nutshell, that's what it is. And the idea is that we use this money to fund our retirement. So we're either not relying on the age pension from the government, or we're not as reliant on the age pension and some of the things that we can get from Centrelink, for example. That's the idea of it.
Okay, perfect. So that makes a bit more understanding as to what superannuation is and the purpose the government has brought this in. Now, like I said, a lot of the working class individuals right now, all of us will have some sort of superannuation balance sitting there. Now, with superannuation, what exactly does it invest into? And how does that investment work? Is it something that we control, the employers control, or is it something that, an investment manager controls? So for someone out there who doesn't really know the intricacies of how the money is invested into, or what it's invested into, can you explain a bit more into the investment side of things?
Yeah, sure. So before I go into that, I would just want to make it clear that we're not talking about self-managed super funds, because yes, they are a superannuation fund, but they work differently. So this is for people that may have an industry fund, for example, or a retail fund that isn't a self-managed super fund. Now, when it comes to investing, so on the highest level, what happens is that you'll likely see an investment allocation. So with the investment fund, for example, typically they'll have something like cash fund or conservative fund or the moderate fund, the balanced fund, the growth fund, the high growth fund. And they have a few others sometimes, but not all of them. So each super fund has different options. Now, the way I mentioned these options, cash is the most conservative, and then high growth is the most aggressive. Now, what that effectively means is when we break down the investment options, so your cash, you won't see any investment in there that's got investment in shares, for example. So you won't see any of that in there. We shouldn't be seeing that, not in cash anyway. As you work your way up, you will see an increase of these increased high risk assets like shares, property, and that sort of stuff. So you might have high growth, for example, which may be, and this is very general, but you might have about 90% of assets that are invested, of your money, invested in high growth assets. So, you might have 40% or 50% in shares, and there may be indirect property there as well. So that's the breakdown. Now, when it comes to who actually chooses these, most super funds, well, all of them will have an investment team. So whether that's in-house or they find someone external, and these people will get allocated a portfolio. So let's say, in some random names, so let's say a super fund has an investment team in-house. Let's say that someone in that team is allocated the balanced portfolio, for example. So they then have he or she has the duty to then invest that money. Now that's very simple. Not one person isn't doing everything, but there's obviously a team there that gets allocated this money, and then it's up to them to go, okay, so how do we invest the balance fund? Typically, you will find that each investment option will have parameters. So, for example, a balanced fund may have an allocation to 60% growth, 40% defensive. So the investment manager's job is to keep that investment in line, but obviously choose the investments that they believe will produce the best outcome for their members, which is ultimately the person that's invested in that super.
Great. Now, in that description, you mentioned a couple of things there, industry super funds as well as retail. Now, going back to my own personal life, my own personal experience of when I used to work for the investment banking, a lot of our clients were super funds, and there were, again, industry as well as retail super funds. And they were all mandated by their own separate rules and regulations they wanted us to invest within. Now, for someone out there that's looking at choosing an appropriate super fund between those two, and if they're just doing the basics of superannuation, what is the difference between an industry super fund? Because we've all seen that ad on TV. You're spending the money big on advertising. And then in the Royal Commission, we also saw the impact about the retail sector and the fees associated with that sort of thing. So there's been a positive connotation towards industry because they're due on the fees, and a negative connotation towards retail. But what is exactly the difference between the two, taking out all these marketing gimmicks that they're using on the basis of choosing one or the other? Because right now we're also seeing the industry super funds being on a negative spotlight right now as well through the regulators. But apart from all that, when it comes to choosing, it gets really complicated for people out there to choose. Can you tell us in a nutshell, what is the real difference between an industry and a retail, and what benefits does one or the other bring?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, industry fund, as the name suggests, it's tied or linked to a particular industry. Like, for example, if you are working in the building sector, if you don't actually choose which superannuation you want, you'll likely end up with CBUS, for example. Now, if you're a school teacher in the public system or a nurse, and again, you don't make an election to which super fund you actually want to be part of, you'll get the default fund in that scenario is Aware Super. So yeah, the way that I look at industry fund is it's linked to the particular industry you're in. Now, whether that's the right one up for you or not, your employer doesn't look at that because it's just a link of the industry that you're in, and it's easier for your employer to say, hey, let's put you into this particular fund because that's where we've been putting everyone else until you make an election, and then you can choose where you want to go. With a retail fund, so it's not actually linked with an industry. Some retail funds have links with particular companies as opposed to particular industries. So you might find a retail fund is linked with a particular business, like a large corporation. Like for example, Woolworths has one where they put their employees. Now, the other side with retail funds is that a lot of advisors would actually can actually recommend retail funds, and that's purely because it could just be the benefit that they have potentially over industry funds. I'm not saying that industry funds aren't beneficial, but it comes back to your question about how do you actually choose, because a big thing that people get or become focused on is the performance of these funds. And the problem is, as we know, these performances are in the past. Yes, we can have a look at it to a degree to go, hey, this particular fund has done X% in returns, and we can look at it in a longer time frame, not just 6 months or a year. But it's a good starting point, but about returns isn't everything. And the other thing that you need to factor in is fees. So are these returns that are being shown pre-fees for the super fund or post-fees? Because if they're pre-fees, that can actually have an impact of what's actually being put back in your account, because that takes away from how much you actually, or how much you've earned overall, and then basically kind of like a net return, for example. And also, what type of investments do you want? Not all funds have the option available. Like a big example at the moment is index funds are becoming a lot popular. Now, to just break that down, index funds are investments that, in a nutshell, it's not this simple, but basically it's a fund that follows, that's invested into particular markets, and they follow those markets. If the market goes up, that particular fund goes up. Where it's, and we'll get into it in more detail, but it's more of a passive approach. So if you're looking for something that's a low cost, you could be looking at a passive investment as opposed to something that's more proactive, and they do cost a little bit more. So fees and performance, and what do you want your super fund to invest in? Because then we can start talking about ethical investments and all that sort of stuff, which some people now want. Not everyone, but some people now want, and then again, not all super funds offer that. Ethical investments.
Okay, great. Moving on from the investment side of things, so as we know, governments make their money through taxation. Is superannuation taxation different to how we pay our normal wages? Because superannuation does form part of our overall wages. We all pay our own income taxes based on the wage that we receive. Now, given that superannuation it gets locked up, like you mentioned, till you hit a retirement age or conditional release, what is the taxation, generally speaking, when it comes down to superannuation funds?
Yeah, so now assuming that we're talking about what our employer puts in on our behalf, those contributions are taxed at 15%. Now, we personally don't pay that tax, so when you do your personal tax return, you don't have to pay that money. When your employer puts for argument's sake, $1,000 in on your behalf, then 15% of that is taken out by the super fund, and they pass that on to the ATO. So you don't actually see it. So it will show up on your statement, of course, but you're not the one that's actually paying that tax. Where if you earn, obviously based on your income, you're more than likely going to be paying more than 15% in your personal name if you have a full-time job.
Perfect. So it is pretty much a fixed rate that of the 15% you're talking about that superannuation pays when it comes to contributions received. Now, on that note of contributions, my understanding is there is different types of contributions that superannuation can receive, and there's obviously rules and limits that apply to each, as well as financial strategies that you can put into play. Now, again, to listeners out there, this is just the general factual information that we're going through about superannuation. So not so much about giving financial advice right now, which obviously we can't, but as a general factual information, can you talk to us about the types of contributions a superannuation can receive and what type of rules and regulations there is for the carry forward and bring forward type of things that people can have a look into?
Yeah, so there's two overarching contributions, and then under these contributions, there's the actual names of which type of contribution it gets classed as. But the two overarching ones is a concessional contribution and a non-concessional contribution. So a concessional contribution is a pre-tax contribution. So what that means, before you pay your personal tax, so whether your employer, most times it'll be your employer pays it on your behalf. So they will take it out of your pre-tax salary and then pay that to your superannuation. Now the limit with that, as we talk today, is a total of over 27,500. Now the other side of the coin is a non-concessional contribution. So this is a contribution that you make after you've already paid personal tax. So let's say, just for an example, that I've saved up 50,000 in my savings account over time from my employment. I've already paid personal tax on that. Then I make a contribution into super as a non-concessional contribution. I don't actually pay any tax on that contribution going into super because I've already paid tax on my personal income, which is above 15%. But because I've already paid tax and I've elected to put this in as a non-concessional contribution, I don't actually pay tax, or the ATO doesn't actually get any tax from that particular contribution. Now, when we break it down, we can break down pre-tax contributions. So concessional contributions can be your super guarantee, salary sacrifice, a personal concessional contribution. So we can go into a lot more detail, but that's a very high level way of doing it, where non-concessional is after-tax money, which can be like a spouse contribution or just a personal non-concessional contribution. So again, there are a few contributions that we can talk about, but in a nutshell, they're the two types. The concessional contribution, as I mentioned, has a limit of 27,500 as we speak today. The non-concessional contribution has a limit of 110,000 per financial year. So I should say that they're both per financial year. And now it doesn't mean you can't make more than those contributions, because it goes back to your question as well, is that there's ways that we can put in more money through the catch-up provision and also the bring forward rule. So the catch-up is related to your pre-tax, so your concessional contributions. So essentially, when I said your contribution cap for concessional contributions is $27,000 500. What that means is that if you haven't actually used those caps in previous financial years, so you can go back up to 5 financial years, and you can actually use those unused caps or space, and actually, so you can add on to your current 27,500. So this can be quite a good strategy if we're trying to reduce tax potentially or boost our superannuation for retirement. But if in a scenario that 6 years has passed, for example, you can only go back 5 financial years. So even though 6 financial years ago, you may even have put in $0, that year is gone. So we can't touch that year. So we can only go back a maximum 5 financial years. Now, a non-concessional contribution has a higher limit per financial year, and the reason is you don't get that tax offset because you don't pay tax going in. But ultimately, you're allowed to do $110,000 per financial year, but you're also allowed to do what they call the bring forward rule, which is essentially use that $110,000 for the next 3 financial years, which includes the current year. So in total, you can put in $330,000 in one go. However, the caveat is you can't use any more non-concessional contribution for the next 3 financial years until the cap resets. Now, there are age restrictions which have been reduced quite heavily in recent times by the government. But yeah, essentially, in a nutshell, that's how the contributions work.
All right, perfect. So we've got an understanding of how superannuation works. Now, to a bit of a summary from my side of things is we know what a superannuation investment class that is, an investment asset. We've also seen that it's quite well taxed at 15%, not going through the intricacies of capital gains tax and all that kind of stuff, which we can park for later on, but a high level for contributions taxes at 15%. And also the ways that we can contribute into super, which is the most common one that everyone uses is the employer contribution. But as also part of that is the concessional contributions, the cap to 27,500 that we can use up to, as well as the non-concessional. So those are the ways that we can contribute to super to grow that vehicle and to go towards our retirement goals much quicker, much faster. And we've also seen the type of industry versus retail super funds options that we do have and how people can make a choice between those two. For someone that's sitting on the fence right now, thinking about reviewing their super, understanding all this, in the last 20 minutes, what we just spoke about, that itself is mind-numbing, right? And we just touched the bases of superannuation at that point in time. So, look, it's very much, for anyone that's looking to do superannuation, it's suggested to use a financial advisor who knows all the details inside out. How does someone that's been elected into a super fund through the employer, for someone that's sitting out there also, not just that being elected through the employer, but also someone that's maybe looking at changing the super fund, how can they go about, as a closing remark, how can they go about having this reviewed? What's the process they should take?
Yeah, so as you said, it's ideal that they speak to a financial planner because there can be consequences of leaving a superannuation fund. The biggest one, or a big one, is insurance, because when you leave a superannuation fund, you also leave that insurance. So we're talking about personal insurance here, so life cover, disability cover, income protection. So you may not be able to receive that in the new fund, so that's a consequence to look at. But yeah, for the people that don't want to go see a financial planner because they don't think it's right for them at this stage, there are a lot of superannuations, like we talked about, industry fund or retail fund, but just dive down, have a think about what type of investments would you like to see? Are you growth orientated? Like, are you trying to see returns, or are you trying to see your super fund invest in certain assets, or not invest in certain assets? That can be important too. But ultimately, once you've chosen your fund, then the actual process of changing isn't too bad. Most funds, when you sign up, will give you an option of rolling over your current super fund, and you just put in your tax fund number, and they actually find which super fund you're part of, and they bring it across. But I do want to stress, it's not as simple as moving over, because there could be consequences to doing that. As I mentioned, insurance, or the other one is that new super fund actually may not be ideal for you. So that's where a financial advisor does come in handy, because they can talk you through the benefits and actually recommend an appropriate super fund for you.
Great. Look, guys, thank you so much for tuning in today for our podcast. As you can see, there is a lot of intricacies when it comes down to superannuation, and choosing the right fund is one, but also it's also just as bad as just rolling over without thinking twice about what exactly are you closing and what are you opening. So it's very critical to get a financial advisor involved. As mentioned, it is a $3.5 trillion market, the superannuation market. It is absolutely massive. So you don't want to be making a wrong decision just for simplicity of doing a rollover because you think it's easy. It's not. Manpreet has showed us today there is so much things to consider. There is also risks of insurance as well as benefits that you may already have inside superannuation that you can lose and never get back again. So it is quite critical to talk to a financial advisor. So if anyone's out there looking at changing or having a review of their superannuation, I think from this podcast we've seen that it is critical to have that professional, find a financial advisor that can sit down with you, have a discussion, and see what is appropriate for you. Manpreet, thank you so much for your wisdom today. And for our listeners out there, looking forward to catching up with you guys in the next podcast. Thank you.